This is the Pixel 9 Pro Fold, and it's actually been out and available for over 2 months now, and in between my time testing and reviewing the iPhone 16 Pro, I've been using this as my main everyday device. And just for context, this is actually the first foldable device from Google that I've ever used, because last year's Pixel Fold actually wasn't released here in Australia. But boy oh boy, have Google made such a compelling device that I've honestly really loved using. Now, is it perfect? Of course not, but as far as I'm concerned, it is up there as not only one of the best foldable devices that you can get right now, but one of the best devices, period. So let's chat about it. Starting with design. And look, whilst as mentioned, I didn't get to use last year's Pixel Fold, I certainly watched a heap of videos covering the device, and I don't think anyone will disagree when I say that this has got to be one of the biggest one-year improvements that a phone has ever received in terms of a design upgrade. Gone are those huge bezels on the inner display. We've now got flat and matte side rails all the way around, and whilst I never got to try that passport style form factor of the first Pixel Fold, the 9 Pro Fold now has a much more standard phone size form factor, and whilst I appreciate that there were a lot of people who loved that passport form factor, if the end goal is to essentially replicate the feeling of a standard phone when a foldable is closed, then I think the change here makes a lot of sense. Just 3 things in particular that I wanted to comment on that I think could use some tweaking for the next iteration. Firstly, this hinge sticking out on the side here. And look, I actually don't have that big a problem with it, and as far as actually using the device, it is perfectly fine, and it's never been something that really bothers me. But that being said, does it kind of look like the LG V50 sitting in that funky dual screen case from 5 years ago? Yeah, it does. So I guess it'd be nice to see Google dealing with this by reducing the size of that side bezel even further to make the device look exactly like a phone when it's closed, like what the Oppo Find N3 looks like. But again, as I said, it's actually not that big of an issue for me. Secondly, that camera unit on the back. For me, whilst I acknowledge the constraints involved when making a folding phone are far different compared to making a regular phone, I definitely wish that Google could have retained that camera bar design language here rather than this elongated rounded rectangle that we have instead. Now, respect to Google, this camera unit does stretch across just wide enough to prevent most side-to-side wobbles when the phone is lying flat on a table, which is great. So as far as functionality is concerned, I don't mind this camera unit design, but in terms of how the phone looks, yeah, I much prefer the camera bar that we have on the regular Pixel phones and last year's Pixel Fold. Just one final note on design, I actually got this crack on the back panel of my unit, which just randomly appeared out of nowhere this week. Like, I haven't dropped the phone, it's in otherwise perfect condition, and yet out of nowhere, all of a sudden, this crack just appeared. Now, maybe I did inadvertently place the phone down too hard on a surface that had something hard on it that might have caused it to crack. Like, it is glass, that can happen. I don't know, and I'm not suggesting that this genuinely did happen out of nowhere, but I did want to mention it just in case. Now, the good news is that I reached out to the Google store online and explained what happened, and they actually offered to replace the phone under warranty completely free of charge, so that is fantastic. And in fact, I will be using the replacement unit for most portions of the B-roll throughout the rest of this video, but again, I just wanted to mention it as a bit of an FYI. Other than that though, in terms of this phone's design, Google has absolutely knocked it out of the park. Okay, from there we have the display, or should I say the displays. And as far as my eye can tell, this cover display feels very, very similar to all of Google's other Pixel 9 devices, both in terms of brightness, but also in terms of fluidity. And then when you open the phone up, the inner display is pretty much just as good. It's 120Hz as well, so it's just as fluid, and it's nearly as bright with a peak brightness of 1600 nits when high brightness mode is activated, and 2700 nits for viewing some HDR content. And as far as that crease is concerned, I mean, yes, it's there, and yes, you can feel it whenever your finger runs over that portion of the display, and you can even see it from most angles too, regardless of what's on the screen. But is it the worst crease I've seen on a foldable? No. Is it the best? Definitely not as well. But does it bother me? Honestly, no. Just one other thing worth mentioning, which is a bit of a nitpick, but neither of the displays go very dim. Now, in recent years, that's never been much of an issue because we're able to just use this extra dim feature to essentially force the screen to go even darker than what the brightness slider natively allows for. However, oddly enough, after the Android 15 update, that extra dim setting hardly has any impact. Even with the intensity set to the maximum, it just does pretty much nothing. Now, thankfully, an app that I used to use all the time on various phones called Screen Dimmer, it still works perfectly and has the option of enabling a quick settings toggle too. So this is pretty much a non-issue for me, but I did want to mention it because clearly there's a bug that needs fixing. Plus, once it is fixed, it'd be nice if Google could integrate the extra dim feature into the brightness slider itself so that we don't even have to use a quick settings toggle. I actually think that was originally a feature that was planned for Android 15, but alas, it never ended up shipping. Now, real quick, I did want to mention the fingerprint sensor, and as far as speed and reliability go, it is pretty much perfect, no complaints there. However, I will just say, setting up my fingerprints in the first place was kind of laughable because it wants you to reposition your finger into all of these different positions and stops the progress if you repeat any position. But I mean, how many positions can my finger really go into when it's side mounted like this? Definitely not as many as Google suggests, I can tell you that for free. It's also interesting and I guess appreciated that I can add more than the 4 fingerprints Google's other devices allow for, which I'm guessing must mean that there's a limitation with in-display sensors versus capacitive sensors, but I kind of wish that it was the other way around, to be honest. And then as far as haptics go, whilst they're good, they're definitely not quite as premium as what you'll experience on Google's bar-style flagship phones. They're still better than a lot of phones on the market, though not quite as nice as the haptics on the Oppo Find N3 for what that's worth. But again, nothing to complain about too much in this regard. Now, as far as battery life goes, 2 things to point out here. Firstly, battery life itself is pretty solid. We do have a 4650 mAh cell inside, which is smaller than both the Pixel 9 Pro and 9 Pro XL devices from Google. And keep in mind, that's in an arguably more power-hungry device. However, that being said, I still haven't managed to kill this thing in a single day, so it's still very reliable. Secondly, and this was a real bummer when I discovered this early on, but the wireless charging coils inside the 9 Pro Fold, they're actually lower in the phone compared to all other Pixel devices. In fact, compared to pretty much every other device on the market. And get this means that whilst it does support wireless charging, it will not wirelessly charge on either of the Pixel Stand wireless chargers, and even on a lot of upright wireless chargers available on the market, which is kind of wild that this wasn't able to be avoided. Part of me wonders if they just completely overlooked this until it was too late. Now, I did just recently find this fairly affordable wireless charger from a brand called Swan Scout on Amazon, which does work, and I'll leave it linked below in case you want to pick one up yourself. But yeah, kind of crazy to me how Google's most expensive phone does not wirelessly charge on its own wireless charger. But at least it has wireless charging, right? Alright, then we have the cameras. And look, I'm not going to spend too long talking about the actual cameras themselves because it's covered in depth in pretty much every review of this phone that you'll find. But I will say that whilst I agree with everyone's sentiments that the cameras on the 9 Pro Fold aren't quite as good as what you'll find on their bar-style phones, as far as I'm concerned, it's still the best all-around camera package that you can get on a foldable device right now. And even more than that, it still outperforms a lot of non-foldable devices too. Like, if I had to pick between this phone or a nothing phone for taking pictures, for example, hands down, it'd be this phone every single time. And I mean, that shouldn't be all that surprising. Like, yes, the sensors are smaller than what Google's regular phones offer, but Google have been doing witchcraft style magic with tiny sensors dating all the way back to the Pixel 2 series. And so as far as photos are concerned, you almost won't have any issues with the results that this phone spits out, thanks to Google's impressive post-processing. Now, what can't really hide behind post-processing? Videos. And so yes, the video quality is a noticeable step down from Google's bar-style flagships, particularly when shooting with the ultra-wide and telephoto lenses in less optimal lighting conditions. But again, I've certainly seen a lot worse from other phones. Nevertheless, there are a couple of other minor quirks that I wanted to point out. For one, who knows why, but when capturing selfies with either of the selfie cameras, the preview looks like hot trash. And then even when you jump into the gallery to view the captured selfie, if you do it quick enough, you can see that the photo transforms into essentially a completely different photo once it's processed. Which, I mean, yes, it's a good thing that the processed selfies actually look okay, but I just found it very weird how awful they look when previewing them. This is the sort of behavior that you'd expect to see from under-display selfie cameras, not from regular hole punch cameras. Thankfully, the issue doesn't persist when shooting videos with either of the selfie cameras, so it's not a hardware issue, and this means that hopefully Google can fix this with a software update at some point in the near future. And then secondly, whilst I really love the concept of this made you look feature, and I'm the perfect target market for this feature given I have 3 young kids myself, but not only does it not work in video mode or with either of the ultra wide or telephoto lenses, both of which are pretty baffling oversights, but on top of those issues, the feature actually uses the selfie camera and not the much higher quality main lens. And this results in images that frankly look really bad in comparison to photos captured without the feature enabled. In fact, the image quality is so bad that I just pretty quickly stopped using it at all. And look, I understand the logic of using the selfie camera to ensure that your subject is looking essentially straight into the lens and not slightly off axis, but if the quality is going to be this bad, then it's not worth it. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, Google should just let us use the 3 rear lenses and then use some sort of AI trickery to slightly tweak everyone's eyeline if the eyeline is even that bad in the first place. Anyway, hopefully Google fixes this sometime soon, because whilst I love the concept, it's just not worth using at all in its current implementation. Okay, last but not least, I want to talk about software, because as far as foldable devices are concerned, the entire experience can be made or broken depending on the software. And for me, the software on the Pixel 9 Pro Fold, it is actually what makes it probably the best foldable device for most users on the market. I mean, the experience just feels so good on this phone, and compared to the software that shipped on the first Pixel Fold and even the Pixel tablet, for example, man, Google have just made huge strides forward in terms of making the experience so much more seamless. Now sure, the Pixel Launcher layout configuration isn't my favorite implementation for a foldable, whereby this half of the inner display's home screen is what acts as the main home screen layout on the cover display. But folks, we're using Android here, and when apps like Tasker exist, there's usually a solution. And well, I've actually been using this custom Tasker profile here, which when the fold is open, sets the Pixel Launcher as the default home screen launcher, but when it's closed, it switches instead to Hyperion Launcher. And this means that I can have 2 completely separate layouts, and it actually works really well. It's not perfect, but it certainly satisfies my needs. There are also a couple of other little quirks, like there being no one-handed mode for some reason, and also sometimes random widgets and icons appear on my home screen when switching to the Pixel Launcher when opening up the device, but I can't really blame that one on Google when I'm using a Tasker workaround. But even with those quirks present, I still freaking love the software on this phone. I mean, of course, there's all of the amazing Pixel features that we all know and love, but then as far as extra features for using it as a foldable device, well, Google have now got this continue using apps on fold setting, which works perfectly. They also have this aspect ratio feature that allows you to essentially stretch out unsupported apps so that they're forced to fill the inner display, which honestly works really well. You've got some neat split screen features too. There's this custom auto rotate setting, and that's to go along with all of the other cool Pixel 9 features recently added, like the Screenshots app, Video Boost, Zoom Enhance, Add Me, as well as a few more. Oh, and by the way, this new feature that Google recently added that allows you to copy data over from another device after you've already gone through that initial setup process, man, this is awesome, and this needs to be added to every device in the future. But yeah, as far as I'm concerned, Google have now gotten the software on their foldable devices to a point that makes them just as good, if not better, than pretty much every other foldable on the market. Now, there is just one issue that I have with this phone, which is that it's actually so good to use in this closed state that I actually rarely find myself wanting to open it. Like, I've sometimes gone several days without opening it at all, and as a result, there have actually been a couple of occasions where I've heard some funky creaking sounds when opening it up, which certainly hasn't made me feel all too confident, but thankfully, this hasn't resulted in any actual issues. Well, None that I know of at least, but honestly, I do wonder whether it's something that I need to be worried about, whether this inner display will become damaged or whether that crease will become more noticeable given how I hardly ever open it. But I reckon that's what this style of foldable device is trying to be. A device that feels pretty much exactly like a normal phone when it's closed and that you don't feel like you need to open to enjoy using, but then in those rare moments where a tablet form factor is actually the preference, well, instead of needing to use a completely different device, you can just open up your phone and boom, there it is. And for that reason alone, that is why I love the Pixel 9 Pro Fold. It is just so close to the normal experience that I'm used to when using their standard bar style phones, but I also have a tablet style form factor at a moment's notice, which you just cannot beat. Now, as alluded to, it's obviously not perfect. As I said, there's still some refinements to be made to its design. The cameras could do with some improving as well, and there's a few software quirks that still need ironing out. But unless something drastic happens before the end of the year, as far as I'm concerned, this right here, the Pixel 9 Pro Fold, this is my favorite phone of 2024.